Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the untold realities of early American colonization by breaking down the historical sources together. We all know the traditional story, right? The Mayflower, the Pilgrims, but digging through the historical records reveals a much darker, way more complex reality about the founding of the Plymouth colony, its relationship with Native Americans, and the true origins of Thanksgiving.
So to kick things off, we're looking at two compelling questions from our source material that reveal a hidden history most people literally never learn. First, when the British settlers arrived, they were greeted in English by a Native American. Wait, how is that even possible? And second, what is the historical Thanksgiving reality that completely flips the context of a beloved American holiday? Let's explore the exact events that laid the foundation for not just survival, but the ultimate American War of Independence.
Our journey begins about 500 years ago. 100 settlers seeking religious freedom established the Plymouth colony, naming it after the British port they'd just left behind. These pilgrims set sail in 1620, enduring a grueling 65-day journey across the Atlantic on the Mayflower, before finally dropping anchor off the coast of Massachusetts that December. Once they settled, they agreed to make their own local laws while still staying loyal to the British crown. Sounds like a pretty promising start, right?
Well, disaster struck almost immediately. They arrived in the freezing cold, and the flimsy wooden huts they built did absolutely nothing to keep out the piercing wind. On top of that, the sandy soil made farming seem impossible, which led to a massive food shortage. Disease spread like wildfire. Tragically, 50 settlers, that is half of the entire colony, died during that brutal first winter. The sources describe the survivors as being in a state worse than the dead, just desperately praying for a miracle.
And then, salvation actually came. The local Wampanoag tribe reached out. A religious leader from the tribe named Samoset, who, amazingly, greeted them in English that he'd picked up from passing English fishermen, came to their rescue. The tribe taught the desperate British a brilliant three-step method to farm that uncultivable sand. They told them to bury fish in the soil, cover those fish with a layer of sand, and then plant the corn right on top. Using the fish as fertilizer worked perfectly, and before long, beautiful fields of corn were growing all around the Plymouth colony.
But as you might guess, this help wasn't exactly free. In exchange for saving them from starvation, the Wampanoag king, Massasoit, wanted something the British had, firearms and gunpowder to fight his own native enemies. This alliance peaked on the night of August 14, 1621, when a group of Wampanoags joined the British in a night raid against a rival village. The British literally rained bullets on the village, killing dozens of sleeping Native Americans. Returning to Plymouth, drenched in the victory of that raid, they decided to celebrate their first harvest. Now, we usually picture the famous wholesome feast. 50 British settlers and 90 Native Americans, including King Massasoit, sharing deer, turkey, and wild fruit. But the dark, hidden context of this 3-day celebration, which of course later became known as Thanksgiving, is that it was essentially celebrated right over the dead bodies of the rival natives they had just slaughtered.
As more British settlers poured in over the years, their agenda quickly shifted from friendship to sheer dominance. Fast forward just 15 years to the Pequot War in 1636. British commander John Mason invaded another powerful tribe, the Pequots. Mason set fire to a large village, and a staggering 700 women, children, and old men were trapped inside and burned alive while crying out for help.
The historical sources give us some truly chilling primary accounts of this massacre, really highlighting the justifications these colonial leaders used. Commander John Mason scornfully wrote that God was laughing at his enemies and had turned them into a burning oven. When he actually counted the bodies, he casually and coldly referred to it as God's just judgment.
And this horrific violence was openly backed by prominent religious figures too. The New England religious leader Cotton Mather even wrote that in just an hour, 500 to 600 barbarians disappeared from the world on which they were a burden. The surviving Pequots were literally tied with ropes and thrown into the sea or sold off as slaves. Over the course of a single year, the entire tribe was systematically wiped out.
Following the massacre, the British went so far as to physically redraw the map to erase the Pequot tribe from history entirely. The Pequot River in Connecticut, that was renamed the Thames River. A town on its banks, originally named Pequot, suddenly became New London. And those English titles remain firmly established on the U.S. map today, completely masking the dark history of the land underneath.
Now, you remember King Massasoit, right? The leader who saved the Plymouth colony from starvation? Well, after he died in 1661, his sons, who had actually taken English names following a curious custom of the time, were brutally betrayed.
His eldest son, Alexander, was accused of conspiracy by the British and tortured to death. That left his younger brother, Medicum, better known to the British as King Philip, forced to take over. And that set the stage for the absolute last Native American War of Independence.
King Philip genuinely tried to keep the peace, but the British relentlessly escalated their mistreatment. They adopted these incredibly insulting, commanding attitudes. They had been trading firearms for land for years, but in 1671, the British forced Philip to sign an agreement fully surrendering those weapons. The Pokanockets lost their arms, their lands, and their prestige. Add to that the British using Christian-converted natives as spies against them, and then the final straw, the Plymouth colony executing 3 Native Americans in June 1675. Philip was completely backed into a corner.
That forced disarmament left Philip's people with absolutely no choice but to fight a decisive battle. This conflict, known as King Philip's War, raged from 1675 to 1676. But the Native Americans were fighting from a tremendously weak position. They were relying heavily on archery and just a handful of smuggled guns from the Dutch and French, going toe-to-toe against a massive supply of British gunpowder.
The sources from this time really detail the sheer mercilessness of the colonists during the war. Reverting to their old brutal tactics, the British set human-inhabited settlements on fire, burning them completely to the ground. And once again, religious leaders casually mocked the slaughter. Cotton Mather shockingly described the burning of these Native American villages as a barbecue.
Philip fought bravely right to the bitter end, but his death in August 1676 was incredibly grim. Ironically, he was killed by a Christianized member of his own tribe named Alderman. But rather than honoring a brave enemy, the British took grotesque revenge. Philip's body was chopped into pieces and thrown into a fire. His assassin preserved his severed hand, literally charging visitors money to come see it. And perhaps most shockingly, the skull of King Philip, again the son of the man who saved the Plymouth colony, was mounted on a spear outside the settlement, where it hung for 25 years.
And this brings us to a really stark historical reality tucked away in the archives. To celebrate King Philip's death and the display of his severed head, the Plymouth and Massachusetts colonies officially declared August 13th a day of public Thanksgiving. This was the specific occasion for which this particular Thanksgiving was proclaimed. It is a massive, jarring contrast to the peaceful harvest imagery we're usually taught in school.
When we look at the legacy of this today, we see a vast historical divide. On one hand, you have the traditional federal holiday, made official by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, celebrated with feasts and family gatherings on the last Thursday of November. But from the perspective of Native Americans in the U.S. today, this exact same date is observed as a national day of mourning. It's a solemn time to reflect on the loss of their lands, their lives, and the profound betrayal of their ancestors.
With Native American resistance largely crushed after King Philip's War, the European settlers thrived exponentially. The environment was so conducive to their growth that the average height of their offspring actually grew by 2 inches. Families averaged 8 children, so the population absolutely exploded. From that single Plymouth seed, they expanded into 13 thriving coastal colonies. Furthermore, after the 7 Years' War, the 1763 Paris Treaty saw France entirely expelled from Canada and the U.S. British dominance on the continent had officially reached its absolute peak.
However, right at the absolute height of their power, the British Empire made 2 catastrophic miscalculations that would eventually cost them everything. First, to pay off their war debts, Britain imposed heavy new taxes on the American colonies, especially on the import of tea, without granting them parliamentary representation. Second, in a sudden reversal, Britain banned European settlers from entering the newly acquired French territories. They reserved those lands specifically for Native Americans, which actually ended up displacing European settlers who were already living there.
Those 2 massive decisions absolutely enraged the colonists and planted deep seeds of rebellion in their hearts. And ironically, these sparks of rebellion ignited right in Boston, a mere 70 kilometers away from where the Mayflower first anchored and the original Plymouth colony was established. The cycle of history was turning right on the very ground where it all began.
Which leaves us with this fascinating, provocative question for our next explainer. How did corporate greed over a tea company, mixed with these bloody colonial foundations, turn into the flames of freedom that birthed the United States of America? It's a complex history for sure, and understanding these early historical facts changes exactly how we view the map of the world today. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.